Hey Bethany Church, it's Pastor Jon here from our Raymond campus, and we are starting this week our first of 5-week lessons into the Old Testament, entitled Old Testament Overview. I know it's original, I'm pretty creative. What we're going to do is we're going to, in 5 weeks, probably a half an hour each week, we're going to be looking at the 5 major parts or areas of the Old Testament. So week 1, tonight, we'll talk about Genesis through Deuteronomy, the law or the Pentateuch. Next week, we'll look at the history from Joshua to Esther. Week 3, we'll go through the poetry and the wisdom books, Job through Song of Solomon. Week 4, the major prophets, and then week 5, the minor prophets. Now, normally, what we do when we go to seminary, or you can take any online Bible course, usually there's Old Testament 101 and Old Testament 201, where they take the concept, or the Old Testament books, and they go into a little bit more detail. But because this is a general overview, we're going to stay somewhat high level. So this week, we'll talk about the Pentateuch. And as we talk about these first 5 books, probably your mind's going to go to a favorite passage or a favorite story that you know, but let's just think that we're going to stay high level. And the goal for me tonight is to give you a general sense and understanding of Genesis through Deuteronomy. And I think when we're done with this, you'll have that. I'm going to attempt to put the PDF of the notes that I'm using for this lesson, attach it to the video in the comments section, so you can just go ahead and print it. Most of this is an original from a lot of different sources. And if you're curious about the sources, you can ask me. But tonight, let's start the Pentateuch. It means 5-volume book, and it's the first major section of the Old Testament. Within it, Genesis especially, but then you have Exodus, and then Leviticus, you have the earliest covenants that God has with Israel. And it's the history of God's covenant people. Genesis gives us the broad view of the universe and all of creation. Genesis chapters 1 through 3 talk about how God created the world in 6 days and he rested on the 7th. And then we have the creation of man given twice in 2 different ways. And then in chapter 3, the fall of mankind or humanity with the Adam and Eve eating of the fruit, being removed from the garden, and the promised judgment and difficulty. I would like to read Genesis 1 in verse 28. God said to Adam and to Eve, "Be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky and over every living creature that moves on the ground." God gives us that mandate to go off and to reproduce and to rule over all of creation. It's also a responsibility to steward the creation that we have. He gives us our role exactly in the creative work, to be under him and to rule and reign under Christ, under God the Father. Later on in Genesis, it narrows the focus down to Abraham and to one nation, which would be Israel. And then we see through these 5 books, Israel as the people of the divine king and his kingdom, where he sets up a law for them to obey, and that law is reiterated. So that's Genesis, basic overview. We're going to go into a little more detail in a minute. But then Exodus through Deuteronomy. Exodus tells us of Israel's escape from Egypt. It's a very familiar story to many of us where God sends the plagues and removes Israel from Egypt. They part through the Red Sea, or the Red Sea parts, they walk through it, and then they come out the other side. Pharaoh's army is destroyed. They're given I always say this wrong, the covenant in Sinai, and they have that covenant. The 10 Commandments are given. Moses breaks them. He goes up, he's given them again. And then we see wandering in the desert of Sinai, the unbelief of the generation that left Egypt. And then we see their disobedience in Numbers 13 and 14. So that is just a basic idea of where we're going to go, Genesis through Deuteronomy. But I would like to just give you an outline of one way a commentator broke down these books. One commentator talks about how Genesis through Deuteronomy give the order of the experience of the people of God. And bear with me as I go through these. As I read them, I thought, well, that's a stretch, but at the same time, I don't think it is that much of a stretch. Genesis describes humanity's creation and immediately being ruined through sin. That creative work happened with each of us when we're born. We're immediately affected by sin and the destruction of sin. That's what happens to all of us. Exodus, God meets our biggest need and our need for redemption. We see that in Israel, God providing a way out of Egypt. God provides for us our deliverance, our salvation through Christ and the gospel. Leviticus teaches Israel how to worship. And every follower of Christ has to learn how to worship God properly. We see in Malachi, he says you're to worship in spirit and in truth. We see that in John chapter 4. We have to learn to love God and love neighbor, a means for us to worship. Numbers, it describes the passing of Israel through the wilderness like our lives as we pass through this hostile world that we live en route to our home in heaven. So we're on that journey in the wilderness, just like Israel was. One day going into our promised land, our inheritance, which is in heaven, and a new heaven and a new earth. And then Deuteronomy, instructions Israel was given to prepare for them to receive their inheritance. And Deuteronomy is much, though it's Old Testament, it gives a lot of instruction for us to understand how we're to follow God and to prepare for our inheritance one day. Just an interesting breakdown. Again, that will be in the PDF and the notes in the comments section. But it was just made me think, there is kind of a parallel when we start out. We're just like Israel. God calls us. We believe in Christ. We're created. We believe in Christ. And then we go through all the wilderness wanderings. So let's stop there and let's jump into Genesis. Genesis is where our lives begin and are immediately ruined through sin. Genesis, the word means in Greek, origin. Geonosis is the Greek word. And when we get Genesis, we're getting the pre-Christian Greek translation of the Septuagint. That's why we call it Genesis. Because the Septuagint was written in Greek, and as people started to put names to these books, we get the name Genesis. Depending on the context, the word can mean birth, genealogy, or history of origin. And that's exactly what we find. We find that God displays himself in the beginning, who he was and what he did. There is no explanation for God. There is no, well, here's a few things about God. It's boom. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The author, we believe it to be Moses. And the audience is God's chosen people, Israel. Now, it wasn't written thousands of years before Moses, because how could Moses have written it? It wasn't written when it happened. It was written afterwards as God revealed this to Moses. At least the creative works before we get into the story of Moses at the end of the book. But the date is probably 1446 to 1406. Remember, BC, you go from a later date down to a smaller date. So we're looking at around roughly a 40-year period, we believe, when he was in the wilderness. God gave this to Moses. And Genesis is an appropriate title because it describes its content. It's a book of beginnings. Just listen to the list of beginnings that we find in this book. We have the beginning of life, the beginning of heavens and the earth, light and darkness, of seas and skies, of land and vegetation, sun, moon, and stars, sea and air. I mentioned sea twice. Well, it happened a lot. Land animals, of human beings. But then we go on. We see the beginning of marriage, of society, civilization, of sin, and of redemption. And in the first words of Genesis chapter 1, we see, in the beginning, God. And the last words of Genesis shows the striking contrast in a coffin in Egypt. We see the difference. One describes Genesis, God and him creating in beauty, and another describes the death of a saint, of Joseph. And then we'll have the Exodus. The basic outline of the book, if you were to open up any study Bible, and I'm not going to go into much detail of this because you can find it in any study Bible, you have it broken down by the word account. And it gives an account of certain situations. So I opened up my NIV study Bible, And I had it all listed here, and I thought, okay, I'm not going to bore everyone to death. But it just takes that phrase, the account of, and it just shares all those stories, and it breaks it down by that. So it's a very simple book. It's a very historical book for us to read and to understand what God is doing. That is Genesis. And there is much debate and discussion within Christianity about different events. For example, was Genesis 7 literal days of creation? I personally believe it was, but there are many godly biblical scholars that would disagree. Then you have the flood. Was it a worldwide flood? Was it a localized flood? Did Moses really bring two of every kind? All of these stories, these two at least, there's just questions, and they're not questioned necessarily by people that don't love God and don't want to seek to follow him. More often than not, it's people that are just trying to figure out the scriptures. Does yom, the word day, literally mean 24 hours? Or does it not? Was it really a flood? Did Noah really have two of every kind come to him in the ark? And did God really flood the whole earth? These have ramifications for how you interpret it. But as there's a raging debate about these, I want you to realize we're not talking about people that don't know Christ and do. We're talking about groups of people that love God, that are just seeking, as they're called to understand the scriptures. Now, I personally love to go into those debates because I love to get in a room with people that love God and go back and forth about stuff. But again, I'm recording this. There's no one else, so it would be a pretty boring back and forth. So we're not going to go into it. Book number 2, Exodus. Exodus is the book of redemption. The need that Israel had for salvation from Egypt, and it parallels our salvation. The word Exodus, or exit, or departure, comes from the Greek word exodos. And we see this word used in Luke 9, where it says that Jesus, after talking with Jesus, they spoke about his departure, which he was about to bring to fulfillment at Jerusalem. He was talking to the disciples. That's what happens when you just put half a verse in there. And you have to remember the context. He's talking to the disciples, and he's telling them that he would depart. There's the Greek word, exodus. He would depart, he would be crucified, and then ascend into heaven. Again, the author is Moses, and the audience is God's chosen people. And again, the same dates for this writing, because we believe it was all 5 of these were given in the same general time frame during the wilderness wanderings, 1446 to 1406. Now, as we think about all these books and when they're written, I just want to give a side tangent. I don't like wilderness wanderings. I really don't. I like it when I get in the car with my family. We just traveled 4 hours up north last week, and I mapped out where we were going. I like to make a map. I put little asterisks. I put maps of where we could go to Fort Knox up there to go State Park. We could go to an island that has a bridge. We can go explore that. Perry's Nut House. If you've ever been to, I think it's Belfast, maybe, one of those places. Perry's Nut House. And I like destinations, but when we're wandering in the wilderness, there isn't one. God just puts us there and says, walk. And as we learn through the wilderness wanderings, that the greatest part of the wandering isn't the destination, but the God that you're with. We hear that. The journey is the adventure, not the end destination. Well, Moses wrote all these as he spent time with God in the wilderness. It wasn't just 40 years of just people dropping dead left and right, though that did happen. It was 40 years where God was speaking to Moses, and Moses was ministering to his people. And judgment was coming upon them, but we have these books as a result. Just a side note. And the theme is God reveals himself to his people. And what we see is he delivers them from slavery in Egypt to establish a covenant with them in the desert. It's a perfect image of the church, because Israel was a group of slaves that, I will tell you, it's an interesting thing to think about. They weren't taken into Egypt. Joseph was in Genesis, but they weren't taken into Egypt. God sent them into Egypt, knowing they would become slaves. It just shows you the picture of how God works in situations we may not understand, but we know what's best. He knows what's best. And as he establishes this covenant with his people that went into Egypt, really didn't know who they were when they came out, God establishes a covenant with them. and starts to help them understand who they are. This lays a foundation theologically. God reveals his name. God reveals his attributes, his redemption, his law, who he is, and how he's to be worshipped. Now, I believe a few minutes ago I put Moses being in Genesis, but we see his first arrival in the book of Exodus. And with the birth of Moses in chapter 2, then we see a burning bush, and that event really lays out for Moses who God is. They didn't have an identity yet as a people. And what we find is if they were just to go from Egypt right into the promised land, they didn't know who they were. They needed these covenants. They needed this time with God. So we have this theologically laid out with the Ten Commandments, then also how God deals with his people. It sets a precedent. Major events. We have Moses appointed as the mediator between God and his people. We have the beginnings of the Levitical priesthood, Levi being a priest and all of the temple and all of those roles that are being laid out. We have the definition of what the prophet's role is, and then we see how the relationship between God and his people, they came under a new covenant at Sinai. And this is really building the foundation of who Israel is, how Israel interacts with God. Before that, we had different covenants, like we had a covenant with Abrahamic covenant, but it was different. You could say they are incorporated now, and now they're becoming an entity. Before they were more of a patriarchal family, and now they're a real people group that has a structure, has a governmental structure. It has, here's how you work, here's how you operate, here's how you worship, here's what you do. It's given all this law. The structure, the outline of the book is there's the prologue, first 2 chapters, God's deliverance of Israel. We got the burning bush, we got the plagues, all of those things. We have the covenant at Sinai, chapters 19 to 24, and then God's royal tent in Israel, the tabernacle, in chapters 25 through 40. It's an exciting, but I will say peculiar way for God to set up his people and to worship. Peculiar is in, I read these stories and I'm like, no guy could have came up with this. It just doesn't make sense. It just seems so divine in how God works and how God orchestrated all of it and how he set up the law. The next book is probably not as exciting if you were to read it front to back. That is Leviticus. It's the book of worship and communion, how God's people are to specifically exercise worship of him. And the word Leviticus, it kind of relates to the word Levites because it really focuses on worship at the tabernacle, what the priests were supposed to do. And it's really, I remember as a kid getting to Leviticus and just kind of like my interest just kind of waned. But when you get into it and you take some time and you study it, you start to see a pattern. We'll get into in a moment. But it's refreshing. It's not here by accident. It has a specific purpose. The author is Moses. Again, the audience is Israel. Same time period it was written, 1446 to 1406. And the theme is Israel receives instructions at the base of Mount Sinai on how to live as God's holy people. How to be in the world, but not of the world, just as we're called to in the New Testament. Theological themes. Let me go into this just a little bit, just to kind of give a basic understanding. Leviticus is a manual of regulations on how he would set up a throne among the people of Israel, Ark of the Covenant, and how it would be worshipped. Much of the regulations for the people and priests is similar to that in Exodus and Deuteronomy and Numbers. Exodus gives directions for the building of the tabernacle. Leviticus gives the laws and directions, a little bit more of a detail. We have the ceremonial cleanliness, moral laws, holy days, Sabbath year of Jubilee. All of these play a role, and all of these teach us principles about who God is and how he operates. I think the one that I found the most peculiar but exciting was the Sabbath year. Every 7th year, Israel was told to let their land rest. And when they went away, they were in the promised land for 490 years, give or take. And God said at the time when he was going to have them go into captivity, he said, I want 70 years. Because the land needs to rest for the time of 70 years because you haven't given me those 70 years of Sabbath rest. And the land did rest. And then you have the year of Jubilee, where I believe it's the 70th year. Here I am, off the top of my head here. It's been years since I studied the year of Jubilee. But it was a year in which Israel was to release their slaves, the Israelite slaves, and they were to have celebrations. But it was built in for us to understand, here's how we're to celebrate, here's how we're to worship, here's how we're to rest. And then, of course, we have the Sabbath, resting on the seventh day. A principle that many have tried to live by, many have ignored, and usually people ignore it to their own physical detriment. It's just our bodies need to rest, and God set that up. The laws are given, for the most part, during the year that Israel camped at Mount Sinai, and that's a long time to be camping. I don't like camping more than like a day, because you get up and there's no air conditioning, but these people camped for like a year. That's impressive. But they did live. That was how they lived at the time. The outline, I just wanted to mention the beginning of it. Chapters 1 through 7 just go into the burnt offerings, the grain offerings, the fellowship offerings, the sin offering, and the guilt offering. There's more I could talk about, but when we look at those, he just describes how God had set up specific offerings for the people to receive, to worship God. And each one of them was very detailed. They were to do a specific thing and go to the tabernacle and offer it, and the priests were to take some. It's very intricate, but it just shows the complexity, but the beauty of how God set up the law. So that's Leviticus. Numbers. Numbers got the title Numbers because it's based on the census. Chapter 1 and chapter 26, you just have a census of the people. And as you get to it, for us, it's like, what in the world? Why are we reading a list of names? But as God put these names in there, it was significant because it shows us we have, in the New Testament, we have the genealogy of Jesus. And we use some of these names. It's quite fascinating that God set it up that way. And they were to have, you have it mostly men because of the patriarchal society at the time. The son of, and you would see that repeated. And then it would give numbers of how many were in this tribe, how many were in that tribe. All of it is the same for author, audience, and date. And the theme is their entire generation is forced to wander in the desert for 38 years. We usually round it to 40, but 38 years technically because of their disobedience. They were supposed to go in. They were afraid of the giants. God promised the land. They wouldn't. And then their punishment is a generation to be lost in the wilderness. Few theological teachings, and again, I am breezing through this, but it is like a 30-minute lesson on the Old Testament, the first 5 books. So it tells the story of Israel's wilderness wanderings. Numbers offers much it's theologically significant. How to establish God's kingdom on earth. Presents the sober reality that the God of the covenants was also a God of wrath. And that's something that we serve the same God of the New Testament and Old Testament. They're the same God. And we see God has righteous indignation. And we see that God brought judgment upon a generation, and they died in the wilderness. He gave them, many of them lived a long life. They lived years, and he gave that to them. But they were never to receive their promised inheritance because of their disobedience. And that should be just a gentle reminder to us that yes, God is a God of love, and he's merciful, and he's gracious, but that doesn't negate our responsibility to follow him and to be obedient to him. He's gracious when we're not. But should we continue, as Paul said, should we continue in sin that grace may abound? God forbid. Let us by God's grace follow him and be obedient, and may his mercy be upon us regularly, but may it not be too regularly in the sense that he's having to pick us up every day, though he does. A lesson for the church: God displays his wrath even against his errant people, but God is gracious, as I just said. The book is broken up into 3 major divisions based on Israel's geographic location. Now, I'm kind of a map nerd, so if I was using a different software, I would have thrown up a map for you to see, but you can go online and look at this. Chapters 1 through 10, they're at Sinai. He deals with them there, and we have some of the recordings. Chapters 13 to 20, they're at Kadesh, and then the plains of Moab from 20 to 32. So that's just a basic breakdown of the book of Numbers. And then lastly, Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy is retrospective. It's a book of instruction, and it kind of is saying over again some of the instruction it's already given. We see all of the same dates about when it was written, except we're thinking it's more towards probably 1406 when they were going into the Promised Land, because Moses did not enter, if you remember. But Israel had this when they entered. So Moses must have written it right before he died, after it was given. The audience, again, is Israel. The word Deuteronomy means a repetition of the law. We get that from the Greek Septuagint. Historical setting, and I'm going to go into the weeds here a little bit on this because I love some of the details I found out about Deuteronomy. I had read it many times, I've studied it, but we're just going to have some fun. Historical setting. Israel is in the territory of Moab, which is the area where the Jordan flows into the Dead Sea. And this is on the east side of the Jordan River. Moses' final act was to transfer leadership to Joshua. And we're going to see that at the end of the book. He delivers a farewell address to prepare his people for their entrance. And he's going to emphasize the law that they needed to follow. It presents for us a proper way of worship. And I'm going to pull up here Deuteronomy. And just at the end of it, I'm going to read a passage. But when he's trying to encourage them, he's trying to say, all right, here's how you're to live. Deuteronomy chapter 33, it just gives a blessing of Moses. And he says, the Lord came from Sinai and dawned over them from Seir. He shone forth from Mount Paran. He came with pyramids of holy ones. From the south is mountain, from his south mountain slopes. Surely it is you who love the people. All the holy ones are in your hand. And your feet, they all bow down, and from you receive instruction. That the law that Moses gave us, the possession of the assembly of Jacob. He was king over Jeshurun, where the leaders of the people assembled along with the tribes of Israel. And what he's doing is he's just going to give a little bit of history, and then he's elevating God, and he's elevating these people to help them remember who God is and what God has done for them. In verse 29, it says, blessed are you, Israel, who is like you, a people saved by the Lord. He is your shield and helper, and your glorious sword. Your enemies will cower before you, and you will tread on their heights. Then Moses goes up Mount Sinai, or Mount Nebo, and then he dies. Moses' last words, he's trying to encourage his people that he's shepherded for over 40 years. Really, maybe, let's say 43, 44, and then has been interacting with for years. And when he does this, what happens is Israel got to see their leader one more time. And then it was passed on to Joseph. I do that every time. Deuteronomy plays a special function. Deuteronomy functions as a massive interruption of the story that unfolds. Genesis to Numbers. And then Numbers picks up really in Joshua with the conquest of Canaan. But Moses' final act is so momentous that Deuteronomy, it kind of marks the end of the Pentateuch. Moses, who was the main character from Exodus all the way up to Deuteronomy, it culminates with his death. The book of Joshua, which narrates the initial fulfillment of the promise, it's a quote here, made to the patriarchs, and the conclusion to the mission on which Moses had been sent, serves as an introduction to the former prophets. Joshua kind of starts with a clean slate in a way. And that's why we have the Pentateuch end with Deuteronomy. Moses is going to renew the covenant and remind Israel what the Lord requires of them. It's a word that Israel needed to hear over and over and over again. And as we're going to find out in lesson 2, there is a pattern that Israel goes through, a pattern much like us today, where we live our own lives our own way. God comes and rescues us. We follow him. We stray. We cry out for help after punishment. And then God rescues us. And this was Moses' ends with saying, hey, follow him. And then we have Joshua, who is going to say to these people, let's go take the hill. Let's cross the Jordan. Let's do a great work. And God's going to say to Joshua early on, here is Jericho. I've given you that city before he even gave it to him. So that is a basic outline of Genesis through Deuteronomy. Again, I'm going to put these notes in the comments if I can. I believe I can put a PDF in there. And we're going to be doing this each Wednesday night from tonight, which is let's see here, I don't even know what date it is, the 26th, all the way through the end of June. So you can tune in and watch this here as well. I'm also teaching these live at our Kittery Point campus at 6:30. If you want to stop by, we'll have the teaching, and then we'll also be having a small group time afterwards just to discuss what we learned. But may the Lord bless you, and I will see you next week. Bye-bye.